About a week or so ago, I did a video talking about the top 10 defenses in NFL history, and I had my own little formula that I showed you, including highlights of all the defenses and how their seasons turned out. So it's only right that I do a video talking about top 10 offenses in NFL history. I don't want to spoil anything, but if you are a believer in the adage, defense wins championships, then you're going to come out looking pretty good at the end of this video. The video begins right after this. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Factor. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian approved meals right to your doorstep. Their team of gourmet chefs create each meal using only ingredients with integrity to help you feel your best all day long. Warmer, sunnier days are calling, so you can fuel up for them with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. Meet your wellness goals in time for summer thanks to the menu of chef-crafted meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. With 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, you'll always have new flavors to explore and it never gets boring. This isn't just lip service. I have been using Factor for a while now. They have plenty of options to make it easy to stick to my goals. They're a go-to lunch and dinner solution if I'm on the run or I'm busy. I've said it in all the other ads that I've done for Factor, and it's 1000% true. They are the real deal. They have my complete and total endorsement, so if you're on the fence about it, you shouldn't be. They are legit. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code BARRY50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code BARRY50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. So before I dive into the top 10 offenses, I want to give some honorable mentions and a shout out to some other all-time great offenses. I mean, to be honest with you, there are so many prolific offenses throughout the years that didn't even make honorable mentions. They'd be the honorable mentions. But that's why I felt a video idea like this was fun, trying to narrow down all that excellence and distill it into just 10 selections. Anyways, let's begin with number 10. 10th greatest offense of all time, the 1950 Los Angeles Rams. Don't you dare X out of this video. I know what you're thinking. You're Xing out of this video because, oh, it's another boring history video. No, you're going to stay and watch this, okay? The 1950 Los Angeles Rams averaged 38.8 points per game, which was first in the league. They averaged over 436 yards per game, also first in the league. They scored 59 offensive touchdowns, and they were 17.2 points per game better than the rest of the league, which is the highest mark of any of the teams on this list in this video. They finished 9-3 because their defense wasn't that great, and they ended up losing in the NFL championship game to the Cleveland Browns 30-28. They scored 45 points offensively in 2 playoff games, which was 22.5 points per game. They are widely known for revolutionizing the game, including spreading guys out in terms of 4 receivers and a tight end, and that's why they were so successful, because they were so innovative and ahead of their time. The 9th greatest offense of all time, 2000 St. Louis Rams. The greatest show on turf Rams lasted 3 seasons, and in 2 of those seasons they made the Super Bowl, 1999 and 2001. But it was the 2000 Rams that most likely had the best offense of the 3. The reason that they aren't as talked about as much as the other 2 editions is because their defense was literally the worst in the league, allowing over 29 points per game. So it's somewhat of a minor miracle that they finished 10-6 and made the playoffs. But anyways, the 2000 Rams averaged 33.8 points per game, over 442 yards per game. They were first in points per drive, yards per drive, in percentage of drives ending in a score. They scored 63 touchdowns overall. They were 13.6 points per game better than the rest of the league. And they did this with Kurt Warner missing 5 games to injury and Marshall Faulk missing 2 games as well. They were just an unstoppable machine. The one bugaboo with the 2000 Rams was turnovers. They finished just 24th in turnovers, but they did just enough to scrape into the postseason, where they played the New Orleans Saints, and they made a furious comeback rally late in the 4th quarter, but as I've alluded on in other videos before, ended with a punt return fumble that sealed their fate, and they lost 31-28. But this Rams offense was so potent that their backup kept it churning, and it also was the reason why Trent Green got a major deal from the Kansas City Chiefs to lead some more of the best offenses of the 2000s that we saw. The 8th greatest offense of all time, the 1983 Washington Redskins. Much like the 2000 Rams, the Redskins in 83 were coming off of a Super Bowl championship, and also like the 2000 Rams, the 83 Redskins averaged 33.8 points per per game, the most in the league. They averaged 383.7 yards per game, which only ranked third in the league, but for such a high potent offense, they ranked first in least amount of turnovers. They scored 49 offensive touchdowns, and they were 12.4 points per game better than the rest of the league, on their way to a 14-2 record, and their only two losses of the season were both by 1 point, including a classic Monday night battle with Green Bay, where they lost and they put up 47 points. Their other loss was a 31-30 loss to Dallas in week 1. So this is a team that came extremely close to going 16-0, but in hindsight, perhaps it's better that they didn't. They would end up making it all the way to Super Bowl 18 before doing a 2013 Broncos impression when nobody knew that the 2013 Broncos would even exist. They picked the absolute worst possible time to have their worst game, putting up just 9 points in a 38-9 blowout loss to the Raiders. They scored 77 points in 3 playoff games for a 25.7 average, but still, the reason this team doesn't get talked about as much as they probably should is because they got crap kicked out of them in the Super Bowl, and their offense was dreadful in the biggest spot. No way around it. But for the first 18 games, that offense was unstoppable. The 7th greatest offense of all time, the 2016 Atlanta Falcons. By all accounts, 2016 Falcons should have won the Super Bowl, and we all know that, and I've gone over it in detail, excruciating detail, many times as to why they did not win Super Bowl 51. But if you look past that, let's look at the rest of their season, shall we? Okay, they had 33.8 points per game, which was best in the league. They were second in yards per game. They were first in turnovers. They were first in points per drive, first in yards per drive, first in percentage of drives ending in a score. They scored 58 offensive touchdowns. They were 11.4 points per game better than the rest of the league, and they finished with an 11-5 record, which was slightly underachieving, but they still got to host the NFC Championship game, and this was Matt Ryan's crowning moment of his career. In his MVP season, they completely destroyed the Seahawks and the Packers in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs to get their Super Bowl berth versus New England, and we all know what happened. They went up 28-3 with the offense contributing 21 of those 28 points, and then they didn't score again in the last quarter and a half, despite having the ball on the verge of field goal range twice when a field goal would have ended the game. Overall, the 16 Falcons scored 99 points in 3 playoff games, so they averaged 33 points per game in the playoffs, which is really good. But god damn it, if they had averaged just 6 more points, couple more field goals in the Super Bowl, they would have been champions, and we wouldn't have had to deal with so much fucking bullshit about Tom Brady. And thus, for the rest of time, 2016 Falcons will not be remembered for their great offense, for what their offense didn't do in the biggest moments. The 6th greatest offense of all time, the 2013 Denver Broncos. Now, I know most of you are saying, how can the statistically best offense ever be the 6th best offense ever? And I'm going to tell you why with this great allegory, because just stay with, okay? Much like Game of Thrones, 2013 Broncos had so many spectacular performances and moments along the way, leading up and teasing all of us into thinking that the season was going to conclude with victory and great feelings, much like how we thought Game of Thrones was going to end, with a great ending, and it was going to wrap everything up in a perfect bow. Because how could it not? Because the seasons before had been so well written, and everything was always great, and it's one of the greatest shows of all time, and the Broncos went into Super Bowl 48 as one of the greatest offenses of all time, and nobody was expecting them to crap their pants. Just like nobody was expecting the last season of Game of Thrones to be as bad as it was. But guess what? The last season of Game of Thrones was such elephant shit that it did spoil and taint all of the great things that it had previously done, to the point where now Game of Thrones is irrelevant. And guess what? Broncos in Super Bowl 48 were such elephant shit that everything they did before that, all the records they put up, all the numbers they put up, they 37.9 point game. They were the best offense ever. They scored 71 touchdowns. They were 15 points better than league average in regular season. They were 13-3. They defeated the Patriots in the AFC Championship game to get to the Super Bowl, and none of that shit mattered because they put up 8 fucking points in the Super Bowl. 8 fucking points. The Broncos offense gave up more points than they scored. They had a pick 6 and a safety. So the Broncos offense outscored itself 9-8. Think about that before you get mad at me for putting this team outside the top 5 despite their numbers, okay? Now, the only time that the 2013 Broncos get mentioned is when people talk about how they got their ass kicked in the Super Bowl, much like how the only time Game of Thrones get mentioned now is how bad final season was. Parallels are everywhere. The 5th greatest offense of all time, the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. Oh, what a heartbreaking end to the season season for Vikings fans in 1998, but don't worry, I'm going to focus on all of the great things that you did that season, which is like averaging 34.8 points per game, which was the most in the league. You were second in yards per game. You were third in fewest turnovers. You were first in points per drive. You were first in yards per drive. You were first in percentage of drives ending in a score. You scored 58 offensive touchdowns. You were a whopping 14 points per game better than the rest of the league. You went 15-1, and in none of your 18 games did you score under 24 points. That's a lot to be proud of. You had a rookie Randy Moss, you had Chris Carter, you had Jake Reed, Robert Smith, Randall Cunningham revitalized his career, was first team All-Pro, didn't win MVP though, that went to Denver's Terrell Davis, but still, Randall Cunningham had a great season, one of the best seasons ever. You guys destroyed the Arizona Cardinals in the divisional round, and were doing business as usual in the NFC Championship game until Gary Anderson missed field goal, and you know the rest. I don't need to go into it, but you guys lost that game 30-27 at home to the Falcons, which gave us a much more boring Super Bowl that season than we should have had. We should have had Vikings versus Broncos in Super Bowl 33, but we didn't get it, all because of a stupid fucking kicker. Fourth greatest offense in NFL history belongs to the 2007 New England Patriots. The 07 Patriots averaged 36.8 points per game first. They were first in yards per game. They were first in turnovers. They were first in points per drive, yard drive, percentage of drives ending in a score. They scored 67 offensive touchdowns. In typical Tom Brady fashion, though, they also benefited more from special teams and defensive touchdowns than anybody else on this list, scoring 8 for 56 points, which decreased their actual real points per game number to 33.3 points per game, which is still very, very good. They averaged 15.6 points per game better than the rest of the league. As you all know by now, Tom Brady won MVP. Randy Moss set the single-season reception touchdown mark. Tom Brady set the single-season touchdown pass mark, which was later broken by Peyton in 2013. And they went 16-0. They won their first 2 playoff games, although they weren't as impressive as they had been earlier in the season. And then, of course, they've lost the Super Bowl. They were on the edge of immortality, going 19-0. They would have been immortal, and the world would have been such a worse off place. Thankfully, Patriots offense failed to show up for most of that game, and they scored a season-low 14 points in a 17-14 loss to the New York Giants. In the Patriots' 3 playoff games that year, they scored 66 points, which equates 22 points a game, which was a pretty massive drop-off from their dominant regular season numbers. But hey, I'm not complaining. One less ring for Brady. The 4th greatest offense of all time, 2011 New Orleans Saints. 2011 Saints have the distinction of being the only team on this list that didn't lead the league in points per game in their season, but they still averaged 34.2 points per game, second only to the Green Bay Packers, who had a historically great offense of their own. They were first in yards per game with over 467. They were also 4th in turnovers. They were first in points per drive, yards per drive, percentage of drives ending in a score. They scored 62 offensive touchdowns. They were 12.4 points per game better than the rest of the league. You want to talk about bad luck? They finished 13-3, and they were a wild card team. In fact, as far as I can remember, I think 2 times in Drew Brees' career, the Saints finished 13-3 and were a wild card team. So that's bad luck. Anyway, the reason the Saints are this high is because of their consistency and because they also elevated their performance offensively in the playoffs, which is something that not a lot of these teams did on this video. They destroyed the Lions in the wild card round, putting up 45 points, and then they went to San Francisco on the road versus one of the best defenses in the league, put up 32 points, scoring 77 points total in their 2 playoff games, which equates to 38.5 points per game, which is more than their regular season total. They also came in the clutch multiple times, but were let down by their defense, giving up multiple touchdowns in the 4th quarter. Simply put, the New Orleans Saints offense did its job to the very end, and that makes it one of the best offenses of all time, and it gets the bump over the 2011 Packers offense because unlike 2011 Packers, the Saints didn't completely go diarrhea all over themselves in their first playoff game. Simply put, with a better defense and maybe a little less bounty hunting by Greg Williams, this Saints team could have been in the Super Bowl. The 2nd greatest offense in NFL history, the 1994 San Francisco 49ers. There are plenty of teams who had better offenses in the regular season than the 94 Niners, although they weren't too shabby themselves, averaging over 31.6 points per game and 2nd in yards per game. Being 5th in turnovers, they scored 60 offensive touchdowns and were 11.8 points per game better than the rest of the league. They had Steve Young, who won MVP MVP. They had Jerry Rice. They had Ricky Waters. They were absolutely loaded. The reason, though, they are this high is a couple reasons. One, I had to have at least one team that won the entire thing on the list. And also, their postseason was an example of dominance that I don't think has been duplicated offensively. In 3 playoff games, their offense scored 124 points, which is equivalent to 41.3 points per game. So they went way above their normal standard in the postseason, especially in the Super Bowl where they scored 49 points, where Steve Young famously threw 6 touchdown passes to beat the Chargers 49-26. And 49ers still haven't won another Super Bowl since this moment. 49ers, yes, have not won a Super Bowl more recently than the Dallas Cowboys, which is hard to believe considering how many times they've gotten close since then, but it's true. Anyway, the 94 49ers, they got the job done, something that nobody else on this list can say. They did it because they raised their level of play to such an extreme extent offensively in the playoffs. They slayed the big bad Cowboy boogeyman, at least for a year. That's why they're here, and I think it's well deserved. Finally, the number one offense in the history of the National Football League, 2018 Kansas City Chiefs. Some of you might not agree with this. Some of you might agree with it. I don't know. In my own eyes, I've been watching football for a long time. This was the greatest offense that I ever personally watched. They averaged 35.3 points per game, which was first in the league. They averaged over 425 yards per game, which was first in the league. They were 7th in turnovers. They were first in points per drive, first in yards per drive, first in percentage of drives ending in a score. They scored 66 offensive touchdowns. Even including special teams and defensive scores, they still averaged 33.1 points per game, which is a really big number. They were 12.3 points per game better than the rest of the league. They finished 12-4, and they ended up losing in heartbreaking fashion, D Ford, in the AFC Championship game to Tom Brady and the Patriots, 37-31. This was Patrick Mahomes' breakout season. This is when everybody realized, holy shit, the Chiefs are going to be a problem for a very long time now that they upgraded from Alex Smith. In their 2 playoff games, they averaged 62 points, which is 31 points per game. But the real reason, and one of the most impressive stats I've ever come across, is that in 18 games that they played, they never once scored under 26 points. That means they literally never had a bad game. They never had a below average performance offensively in any game. And if their defense, like I said, D Ford, wasn't such a bumblefuck, then they would have gone to the Super Bowl and they most likely would have won. But this was an offense that could really just destroy you anyway. And it's a shame that they weren't able to get to the Super Bowl, because it would have been much more exciting than the piece of shit Super Bowl that we got, and having to watch Brady win another ring where he was underwhelming and didn't really do much. But anyway, 2018 Kansas City Chiefs, they're the best offense that I've ever seen, and this is my list, and that's why they're number one. Unlike my top 10 defenses ever video, I decided to make a cute little chart which has all the stats and stuff organized for all 10 selections, so you can compare them side by side. If you're into that kind of shit, if you're not into that kind of shit, well then, fuck you. This is my video. I can do what I want with it. And you probably shouldn't be watching this channel because it uses a lot of stats. But if you do find the chart interesting, well, I'm happy because I was thinking of you. And that does it for this video. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and please, for the love of God, make sure this video gets a shitload of views. Thank you.